The palace of the alien Empress trembled as distant thunder rolled through the skies. But it was not the sound of storms. It was the roar of enemy starships unleashing fire upon the capital. The walls of her throne room, once a symbol of power and eternal rule, now shivered with each blast as cracks spread across the marble pillars and golden arches. She sat still upon her throne, her long robes flowing around her like a pool of starlight, and her jeweled crown, once admired by millions, felt heavier than ever upon her head. Around her, the banners of her empire hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly from the shockwaves outside, and the glow of the great crystal chandeliers flickered as if afraid of the darkness. Pressing in, her elite guards, trained since childhood to never falter, stood in a circle at first, their faces pale but their weapons raised. Yet as the palace gates thundered under the battering of enemy cannons, their eyes shifted, their breath shook, and one by one, fear slithered into their hearts. The Empress, proud and unbending, spoke with calm authority, commanding them to hold their ground. But their loyalty cracked like brittle glass when the gates finally burst open with a deafening crash and smoke filled the great hall. The guards exchanged quick glances, their courage breaking all at once, and they fled, dropping their shining spears upon the marble floor with a clatter that echoed louder than the cannon fire outside. The Empress's heart sank, but her face remained still, for she knew her enemies expected fear, and she would not give them the satisfaction. Yet the silence that followed was louder than any battlefield. The room that once held 100 loyal warriors was now a hollow chamber where only her breathing filled the air. She closed her eyes, hearing the cries of her people in the city beyond, and she wondered if this would be the day her line ended, if her crown would be taken as a trophy and her empire burned into history. The smoke cleared, slowly revealing the shattered doorway, and through it came the sound of boots marching closer, the sound of victory for her enemies, and still she sat upon her throne, waiting for the end. But then, from the shadows at the edge of the hall, a figure stepped forward, not tall like her alien kind, not clad in golden armor, but a human soldier, his face marked by battle and his armor dented and scarred. He was not one of her people, not even of her world, yet his steps carried no fear. His hand rested firmly on his blaster rifle, his stance steady, and his eyes locked onto hers with something she had not seen in anyone that day, unshaken resolve. She frowned slightly, unsure if he was an assassin or a savior, but he raised no threat toward her. Instead, he positioned himself before the throne, his back turned to her, as if his own body was meant to be her final shield. The Empress, silent and proud, studied him as the echoes of the fleeing guards still lingered, and she could not understand why a stranger would stay when her own people had deserted her. The gates rattled again as enemy soldiers prepared to storm inside, their voices growing louder, and still the human did not move. His armor was scratched, his boots worn from campaigns she could not name, yet he stood taller than all who had sworn oaths to her. She finally spoke, her voice sharp but carrying curiosity. "Why do you remain, when even my own sworn guards have abandoned me?" He did not turn his head, but his reply came with the weight of iron. "Because someone must stand, and I will not see a ruler struck down while her people scream for hope." The Empress's chest tightened, though her face remained carved from stone. The human adjusted his grip on the rifle, his stance unwavering as the shadows of enemy soldiers stretched across the smoke-filled threshold. The ground shook with another explosion. The crystal chandeliers above rattled dangerously, and the throne room became a cage of silence broken only by the approach of death. The Empress, for the first time in her life, realized she was not ready to die, and yet she could do nothing but watch this stranger prepare to fight a battle. He had no reason to fight. The gates gave way fully, the clash of metal and the stomp of boots filled the hall, and the enemies poured in like a flood of steel and fire. The Empress tightened her grip on the arms of her throne, her crown shimmering faintly in the failing light, while the human soldier raised his weapon, his voice low but steady as he whispered words meant only for himself. "Not while I still breathe." The enemies stormed into the throne room, their armor black as night and their weapons glowing with deadly light. But the human soldier did not move aside. He became a wall of flesh and iron between the Empress and her doom, and the air grew, thick with the tension of an inevitable clash. Blaster fire cracked across the hall, sparks dancing against the marble, yet the soldier answered with quick precision, each shot from his rifle cutting down the first wave before they could reach the throne. The Empress sat frozen, her eyes wide not from fear but from disbelief, for every move he made was sharp, fearless, and unyielding, as though he had trained his whole life for this moment. His shoulders shook from the force of recoil, his breath came rough, and still he did not step back even when the enemy pressed harder with more soldiers pouring through the broken gates. A blade swung for his side, and he parried it with the stock of his rifle, striking the attacker down before turning his weapon back on another foe. The Empress, who had once commanded entire legions, could only watch as this lone human fought. With more loyalty than 100 of her sworn guards, her mind burned with questions. Who was he? Why did he stay? What made him choose her when he owed her nothing but she could not ask? For the battle raged fiercely round them. The sound of boots echoed like thunder, smoke curled through the chamber, and the golden banners of her empire caught fire one by one, their flames reflecting in her eyes as though the world itself was being consumed. Still, the human fought on, shielding her with every move, his body twisting to absorb the force of attacks meant for her. Then, in a brief moment of calm, when the enemy forces pulled back to regroup, she rose from her throne and demanded an answer, her voice sharp, though the weight of fear lingered in her chest. Tell me, soldier, why do you fight for me, when you are not of my world and owe me no loyalty? He lowered his weapon slightly, though his stance never wavered, and turned just enough for her to see his eyes, cold yet burning with an inner fire. His reply was steady, a vow spoken like iron. Because your life is not only yours, you are. More than a ruler, you are the hope your people cling to, even when they hide in fear. If you fall here, so does their chance to rise again. I swore an oath long ago to stand against the darkness, no matter whose blood runs in their veins. And I will not break it now. The Empress's chest tightened, for no one in her empire had ever spoken to her like that, not as a queen but as a person whose survival meant more than her crown. Before she could answer, the enemy surged forward again, stronger than before, and the soldier raised his rifle once more, his voice low but clear as he added, "Stay behind me. As long as I stand, they will not touch you." And with those words, the storm returned to the throne room, fire and steel crashing around them. But at its heart stood a single human who had turned himself into her shield, a stranger who had already proven to be worth more than all the guards who had fled. The throne room burned with smoke and fire as the enemy pushed harder, their footsteps pounding across the marble like drums of war. And yet the human soldier did not falter, his rifle flashing with relentless bursts that forced them back step by step, his body always fixed as a barrier between the Empress and certain death. Sparks rained down from shattered chandeliers above, and the golden walls, once a proud symbol of her dynasty, cracked under the assault, the palace itself trembling as if it shared her fear. The Empress followed close behind him as he moved through the chaos, her robes brushing against fallen weapons, her crown tilting slightly as she ducked behind his armored shoulder. When blaster bolts tore through the air, never in her life had she been so near to battle. Never had she smelled the smoke of burning banners or heard the screams of dying men so close. And each sound etched itself into her memory. But what struck her most was the man before her. How he shielded her without hesitation, how he seemed to sense every strike before it came, how he took the weight of the storm without complaint. His armor was already scorched, a jagged crack across his shoulder bleeding faintly. Yet he did not pause, even when the sting of wounds slowed his breath. At one turn in the corridor, an enemy charged from the shadows with a glowing blade, and the human spun so quickly that the Empress felt the wind of his movement, his rifle swinging like a hammer to knock the attacker aside. Before firing a single shot that ended the threat, her heart pounded not from fear of death but from a strange mix of awe and disbelief. For here was a man not of her race, not of her world, carrying her life on his shoulders as though it was the only mission that ever mattered. She began to wonder if fate itself had sent him. for no soldier of her empire had stood so firmly when darkness came. The palace halls seemed endless, a maze of broken pillars and burning tapestries, every turn leading them deeper into danger, and the Empress's strength began to wane, her steps slower, her breath sharp. But the human noticed without her speaking. He guided her with one hand when he could spare it, urging her forward. His voice steady despite the storm around them. "Do not stop. They want you cornered. We must move." His calm gave her strength she did not know she had, and she obeyed, pressing forward even as the echoes of enemy war cries chased them. At one point, the two of them entered a long hall where the windows had shattered, and through the smoke-filled sky she saw the city below, her capital burning, her people scattering in terror as starships rained destruction, and her heart clenched, with a pain sharper than any blade, for she had sworn to protect them. And now they suffered because her throne was under siege. She faltered, whispering that perhaps her death would end their suffering. But the human turned sharply, his eyes fierce as steel as he growled, "Do not think that. If you fall, they lose everything. They need to know you live, because hope dies faster than any city can burn." His words cut deeper than fire, and though she had worn a crown since birth, it was this stranger who reminded her what it truly meant to rule. They pressed on, every step a battle, every corner an ambush, the halls echoing with the clash of weapons and the hiss of blasters. And always he placed himself before her, taking blows that would have ended her life, his strength unbroken even when his body begged for rest. By the time they reached the grand stairs that led to the inner chambers, the Empress's gown was torn, her crown nearly lost, but her spirit was burning anew, fueled by the sight of one man standing where an army had fled. She knew now that whatever came next, the galaxy would remember not only the day her empire fell into fire, but the moment a lone human soldier turned himself into her shield and carried her through the halls of death. The palace groaned as another blast struck its outer walls, sending dust raining down from the ceiling and cracks spreading across the pillars. But the human soldier guided the Empress deeper into a hidden passage, carved behind the grand stairway, a path few knew even existed, and the narrow stone corridor swallowed them in darkness lit only by the faint glow of emergency lamps. The sound of their footsteps echoed, mixing with the distant roar of the battle above. And for the first time since the throne room was breached, they had a brief moment, away from the storm. The Empress leaned against the cold wall, her breath heavy, her crown tilted, her once flawless robes torn and marked with ash. And she stared at the man who had dragged her from certain death, with more resolve than anyone born under her banner. She could not stay silent any longer, for her heart demanded answers. So she asked with quiet urgency, "You risk your life again and again for me. But why? You are no subject of mine. What binds you to this fight?" The human did not answer at once. Instead, he stood still in the dim light, listening to the distant sounds of soldiers searching above, his weapon held ready in case they discovered the passage, and only when the silence stretched long did he finally turn, his expression shadowed but his eyes burning with something she could not name. His voice was low yet carried a weight like stone as he spoke. "Long before I stood here, I made a vow not to a throne, not to a crown, but to the living. I swore I would never let the innocent fall, if I had the strength to stand, and I would fight the darkness wherever it spread. That vow was all I had when my own world was burned, when my people scattered, and when I was left with nothing but the will to keep going. Tonight, that vow has brought me here." The Empress felt her chest tighten, for in his words she heard a pain that echoed her own, a wound carved by loss, and though she was a ruler of millions, she suddenly felt small before the weight of his story. She stepped closer, her voice softer now but edged with curiosity. "So you fight not for me, but for a promise you made long ago." He nodded, gripping his rifle tighter. "Yes, but understand this: your life is more than yours alone. Too, your people, you are not just flesh and blood. You are the symbol they cling to in the fire, the one hope they believe cannot be extinguished. If you fall, they will surrender to despair, and the enemy will not just win, they will erase everything you ever were." His words struck her harder than any blade, for though she had ruled as Empress for years, surrounded by ceremony and power, She had never heard her role described with such raw truth. She thought of the city outside, burning under enemy fire, of the terrified faces of children hiding in ruins, of the desperate cries of her people echoing in the streets, and she realized that her life was not hers to give away. The corridor shook again, dust raining from the ceiling, reminding them that time was short, and she straightened herself despite her exhaustion, her voice now firm though her heart raced. Then I cannot fall here, not while my people need me. If your vow binds you to this cause, then know this your fight is my fight too. The human gave the faintest nod, a flicker of respect crossing his battered face, and for the first time since the invasion began, the Empress felt a strange spark of strength that did not come from her crown or her throne, but from the presence of the man who stood beside her. Yet their moment of calm shattered as shouts echoed from the far end of the passage, enemy troops having discovered the hidden path, their boots slamming against stone as they advanced. The human shifted instantly, pulling the Empress behind him once more, his rifle rising, his voice steady. Then we stand together, but remember, as long as I breathe, no harm will touch you. And with those words, the darkness of the corridor lit up with fire as the battle followed them even into the hidden places of the palace, and the Empress understood that every secret revealed had bound their fates tighter than before, making her wonder not if they would survive the night, but what they would become if they did. The hidden passage shook as enemy soldiers advanced from both sides, their shouts echoing through the narrow stone walls, leaving the Empress and the human soldier trapped between two approaching forces. And for a fleeting second the Empress felt the weight of doom pressing on her chest, but the human's stance did not waver. He glanced at the path ahead, then at her, and with calm resolve said, "We can still break through if we move fast. Stay close to me." The corridor erupted in blaster fire, sparks bouncing from stone, smoke filling the air until every breath burned, yet he pushed forward, his rifle blazing, every step a struggle through the storm. The Empress clung to the folds of the wall, her heart racing with every bolt that passed inches from her, but she never once let her eyes leave him, for his figure in the chaos was the only steady thing left in her world. They reached the end of the passage and burst into the star docks, a vast open chamber of steel and glass where ships once carried nobles across the stars, now a battlefield shrouded in fire and ruin, the floor littered with debris and the broken bodies of those who had fallen before. The docks were the last escape route, the last bridge between her survival and her capture. But already enemy forces swarmed the platforms, their weapons ready, their banners waving triumphantly as if her defeat was already certain. The human soldier led her behind a shattered cargo crate, scanning the docks with sharp eyes, his armor cracked and blackened, his breathing rough. Yet his voice remained steady when he whispered, "We are outnumbered, but not out of time. If I can hold them here, you can reach one of the ships. You must leave, even if I cannot." The Empress felt a chill at his words, her throat tightening with a fear she had never known, not for herself but for the man who had already bled for her more than any sworn guard ever had, and she spoke with rare urgency. "No, I will not abandon you. Without you I would have fallen already. If you die here, my people lose more than their Empress. They lose the shield who stood when all others fled." He turned to her then, his face hardened by battle yet softened by something deeper, and he shook his head. "My oath is to protect you, not to survive. If this is where I fall, then it is where I was meant to stand." His words pierced her like steel, and she realized that this was not just a soldier, but a man bound to a purpose greater than his own life. The enemy shouted, their ranks closing in, and without another moment to spare, he rose from cover, his figure tall and unyielding against the blaze of fire. Shots tore through the air, striking his armor, knocking him back. Yet still he advanced, returning fire with ruthless precision. Every blast he made clearing a path that would not have existed without him. The Empress, trembling yet unwilling to cower, followed behind as he fought, each step forward gained by his sacrifice, his shoulders jerking with the impact of hits he refused to fall to. The docks roared with battle, steel ringing, smoke curling, into the high glass dome where cracks spread wider with every explosion, until it seemed the heavens themselves might collapse upon them. The human soldier staggered once, blood trailing down his arm, his rifle nearly slipping from his grasp, and for the first time the Empress cried out, her voice breaking through the fire, "Do not fall, you cannot fall now," and as though her words fueled him, he straightened, lifted his weapon again, and drove the enemy back with a fury that seemed born not of strength, but of sheer will. Yet she knew his body was failing, each movement slower, each breath harsher, and the dread that he would collapse before her eyes gnawed at her heart. Still, he refused to yield, planting himself like a wall before the ship's boarding ramp, his body shielding her even as bolts scorched the air around him. And he shouted with one final surge of defiance, "Go, your empire lives if you live. I will not let them take you." The Empress stood frozen, her crown glinting in the firelight, her spirit torn between duty and the bond that had formed in the shadow of death. And she swore silently that if he fell, the galaxy itself would remember his name. The last line of enemies surged forward, their weapons raised, their eyes hungry for victory. And in that desperate moment the human soldier raised his rifle. For what might have been the last time, his body bloodied, his armor shattered, yet his resolve unbroken, a single man standing alone against the tide. And the Empress realized with a sharp breath that she was witnessing not just the defense of a throne, but the making of a legend whose story would outlive them both. The star docks shook as the battle reached its peak, the glass dome above shattering into a rain of broken shards that glittered like dying stars while fire spread across the steel platforms, and in the center of that storm stood the human soldier, his body battered, his armor fractured, yet his stance unbroken as he fought with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything still to protect. The Empress watched in breathless horror as he forced back the tide of enemy soldiers, every shot from his rifle carrying the weight of his vow, every movement tearing him closer to collapse, and though his body screamed for rest, his spirit refused to yield, his eyes fixed only on the mission that had become his purpose to shield her until she was safe. The enemy pressed harder, their numbers overwhelming, their weapons blazing, but the human met them all, his blood staining the steel floor beneath him, his hands trembling as he reloaded, and yet he rose again and again like a storm that refused to fade. The Empress, who had once believed herself strong, realized now that true strength did not lie in crowns or armies, but in the unshakable will of one man who stood when all others fled. And her heart burned with a mix of awe, sorrow, and a fierce determination she had never felt before. At last, with a desperate surge, the enemy forced him back against the edge of the boarding ramp, his rifle running low, his breath ragged, and the Empress thought she would see him fall. But with one final roar of defiance he drove forward, using not just his weapon, but his own body, striking down the last attackers with sheer will until the platform was silent, but for the crackle of fire. For a moment there was only stillness, smoke curling in the air, the city burning beyond the shattered dome, and the Empress felt her knees weaken as she saw him stumble, his rifle slipping from his grasp, his chest heaving with exhaustion. She ran to him, catching his shoulders before he could fall, her hands trembling as she lifted his head, and she saw in his eyes the same unyielding fire, though it flickered now like a flame at the end of its strength. "You cannot die," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time, the weight of her crown forgotten, "for without you, I would not be here. My people would not have their hope." He gave a faint, pained smile, his voice rough as he replied, "I told you, as long as I breathe, they will not touch you. That is my vow." Tears blurred her vision, though she had never wept before her people, and she pressed her hand over his, promising through the tremor in her voice, "Then I swear before the stars, you will not be forgotten. You are not only my shield, you are the reason my empire will rise again." As if her words gave him strength, he forced himself upright, his legs unsteady yet his presence still towering. And when the remaining survivors of her people reached the docks, soldiers and civilians alike, they stopped in awe, for they saw their Empress standing unbroken beside a human soldier who had bled for her throne. And in that vision, they found the courage to lift their heads and believe that their empire was not lost. The Empress raised her voice above the chaos, declaring that the crown was not hers alone, but belonged to all who still fought. And she named the human not as a servant or a stranger, but as the living proof that loyalty, courage, and sacrifice were greater than fear. The people, stirred by her words and by the sight of the man who had stood against an army, rallied around her, their voices rising in unison. And even in her weariness, she felt a spark of destiny ignite, for she knew the galaxy would remember this night not as the fall of an empire, but as the birth of something greater. As the last ship rose into the burning sky, carrying them toward survival, the Empress looked at the soldier by her side, his body weakened, but his spirit unbroken. And she whispered so only he could hear, "You will never stand alone again. For as long as I rule, your vow is mine as well." And in that moment, amid the smoke and the stars, the bond between them became more than a shield and a crown. It became a legend that would echo across worlds, a story of how one human soldier, with nothing but his will and his body, had turned the fate of an empire and carved his name into the eternal memory of the galaxy.